Good morning. My name's Tom Wardle, and I'm a senior Dharma teacher with Empty Moon Zen. So, you might want to strap on your seatbelts, everybody, because today we're going to talk about Dogen. But before I get into that, though, I actually want to talk about streaming video. Not one of the rapidly growing numbers of online services, but the streaming video in my own head. I've had it as long as I can remember. And while I do get lots of my favorite movies and shows, as well as my favorite songs, they tend to be frustratingly short clips that play on endless repeat until something else replaces them. There's actually a pretty good selection overall, but by far my favorite thing to watch is my own life. In my head, my life streams pretty much constantly, and there are really two different series. There's my life before, the past, and my imagined life in the future. And it's a little weird because sometimes that one's a really uplifting story, and there are other times where it's just wholly depressing, even hopeless. The point is, my whole life is stories. My experience of every moment, of everything, is a story. I think in stories. I live in stories. Sometimes I'm totally caught up in what I'm watching, almost as if the present did not exist at all. But sometimes I see the stories. This is one of the things that can happen through our practice. We sit down and pay attention, watching the activity of our minds, just noticing. I notice these stories sometimes, and I notice that there are stories that are animated, but there are also stories that are static. I have stories about what things are, stories I attach to pretty much everything I perceive. So I often find myself wondering what the world would be like before stories. What am I like before I start telling stories? Before I start sticking labels on everything, including myself? It's interesting to contemplate a world beyond our stories and labels. Dogen tells us in his commentary on the Heart Sutra, form is nothing but form. Emptiness is nothing but emptiness. 100 blades of grass, 10,000 things. This points directly to the thing unto itself, with no thoughts attached to it, none of those labels with all of their connotation and baggage, just the world as it is, uncolored. This suggests a very important and subtle element of Buddhist teaching you may have noticed from our chanting of the Heart Sutra, that consciousness itself, mind itself, is included as a sense. We're not talking the Aristotelian 5 senses. In Buddhism, we have 6. And the concept of mind is not limited to this thing sloshing around between our ears, nor is it limited to ourselves. The concept of mind goes beyond the self, beyond the body. It's inclusive. All of this around us right now is mind. Your mind. My mind. It suggests we project our own mind and apply it to the world like a veneer or a really thick layer of paint. But the world itself exists underneath that, underneath our projections, underneath the stories that we tell about the things that we perceive. I find this absolutely fascinating, and my practice has evolved to try to look at that, to try to catch a glimpse of what exists behind the fabric my mind wraps around the world. And of course, when we start watching ourselves, observing the activity of our own minds, we notice things. We notice these stories that we tell, and if we can look beyond the stories, not getting taken in by their content, turning the light around to shine within, we notice patterns. And it's amazing to me how quickly I start telling another story about what's going on. There's a really useful word about this in Japanese, nen, which literally means mind moment. It's written with 2 characters, the first of which means present or now, and the second of which is shin, which may be familiar to you already. It's that heart-mind-consciousness unity that is our being itself. The traditional teaching is there's 60 nen in the snap of a finger, 75 in a second, and something like 6.5 billion in a day. But who cares? The numbers don't matter. The point is that these moments happen incredibly quickly. The activity of our mind happens in a flash. And the amazing thing about it is that our thoughts stack. In a mind moment, I have a thought. But then in the next mind moment, I have a thought about that thought. And I can put on as many of these hats as I want. Having a thought, judging that thought, judging the judgment of that thought, having a thought about what would be better, having a thought about how it and what it all means. Just on and on and on. And with each one, I'm getting farther and farther away from just this. From the simple reality that our whole lives take place in those tiny little moments. To me, this is an absolutely incredible idea, that each thing exists in a discrete moment. In his extremely challenging text, Uji, or Being Time, Dogen leans into this. Firewood becomes ash. Ash cannot become firewood again. However, we should not view ash as after and firewood as before. We should know that firewood dwells in the Dharma position of firewood and has its own before and after. Although before and after exist, past and future are cut off. Ash stays in the position of ash with its own before and after. Every single moment is a thing unto itself. Sure, it has a past and it has a future, but it's not a continuity. Dogen puts it somewhat more succinctly in Genjo Koan. Although there is before and after, past and future are cut off. Just this moment, just right now. And the challenge that we take up in our practice is meeting that moment. Now, we tend to think of life as a stream, as a continuity. But I really want to ask, how's that working for you? Because for me, it's a disaster. It's a source of great suffering, carrying all of the baggage of my past and my perceived mistakes and my regrets into now. Just an enormous pile of luggage that I drag around with me all over the damn place. Actually, sometimes it feels more like it's all piled up on my back. And I've got to tell you, it's exhausting. I also think it's quite limiting. So what if we see it a different way? What if we accept Dogen's invitation and try to see it as these discrete individual moments? Instead of the continuous stream we usually experience it to be, what if life is a series of these individual moments in time? The being and the time, you and me and all of it, wound up together in moment after moment. Again in Genjo Koan, Dogen writes, "Do not say that life becomes death. Call it no arising. Life is a position in time. Death is also a position in time. This is like winter and spring. We don't say that winter becomes spring, and we don't say that spring becomes summer." There's a fascinating possibility embedded here, one that gets me really excited, one that could help me with that huge pile of luggage that I drag around with me everywhere. And that is the possibility that what I recall of the past is not actually connected in any continuous way with the present. Isn't that good news? We can just stop dragging this pile of stuff with us all over the place. Just let it go. And sure, it did exist, and through karma it echoes. But I don't have to carry it with me everywhere I go. And I don't have to lift it all before I can do anything else today. To me, that's a thrilling possibility for true freedom. And maybe a little scary. Part of what's so hard about it is that all of that baggage is really compelling. There are things in there that I'm really attached to. There are things that I like to take out and look at. Some of them make me feel good. Some of them make me feel terrible in this present moment. Shohaku Okamura writes, "The present moment is the only true reality." The problem is, I honestly don't know much about what it is, and that can be scary too. Also, it has no length. What is the present anyway? Okamura describes it as a geometric line with no width that separates past and future. So it's this thing that's almost not a thing. It's constantly changing, and it's my inability to pin the present moment down that creates stress. My inability to hold on to that moment is painful. That's impermanence, and it's just how the universe works. When I cling to a moment, I suffer, and when I try to avoid a moment, I suffer. But our practice brings us back. That's the practice, coming back. Sure, sometimes you might have moments of abiding in the present. Awesome. Good for you. I think I've had a few of those too. And sometimes they're really sweet. And that can certainly feel like an accomplishment. But don't judge it, and don't try to judge your practice. Watch out for those Nen hats starting to stack up again. The thing is, abiding in the present moment isn't actually our practice. Certainly it's something that happens sometimes, but as far as I can tell, it's mostly accidental. What our practice really is returning. It's noticing, I'm putting on hats again. I'm watching that show about the past or the one about the future. Okay, I'm just going to turn it off. Come back. Return to my cushion. Return to my breath. Return to just this. And because I can't hold on to it, I find it really helpful to frame that as a question. What is this? What is this? I'll leave you with a story that speaks to the potential of this way of living. Doyu Ozawa was a Zen monk who was captured by the Soviets in Korea at the end of World War II. And he spent about a year in a prison camp in Siberia, during which time he lost both of his legs to frostbite. When he returned to Japan, he had a hell of a time. He really struggled. But he was committed to his practice, and eventually one day he had what he called a flash of light. Describing it, he wrote, "I realized that I suffer because I compare myself to other people. That I was born 27 years ago is the origin of my mind that makes such comparisons. I will quit thinking that I was born 27 years ago, and I will make today the day of my birth, just as I am, a man without legs. The person born today is completely brand new. Therefore, I have just been born today." By letting go of his story, he was able to accept who he really was. So, with that, I'll close by simply wishing each and every one of you a very happy birthday. Thank you.